Dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Marko Siddi. I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Today I will be moderating a panel on a conversation on the EU's climate and energy policies. We have some excellent speakers with us, but let me start by introducing the panel with a few words. The climate challenges are mounting. Every year, more and more severe weather conditions are emerging. And we have just had one of the hottest summers ever recorded, with droughts in large parts of Europe. So climate change is really in front of us, and we see it on a daily basis. The EU has been on the front lines of dealing with the challenge. It has developed an energy and climate framework, actually more than one. We are now in the second framework with targets for the year 2030. But meanwhile, we have been coping with an energy crisis and with acceleration of plans to decouple the European Union from Russian energy supplies. So the aim of this panel is to outline the viability of the EU's climate policies in the context of the current multiple crises, I would say. So the conversation is hosted by the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. It is part of the conference, the Baltic and Nordic EU Conversations 2023, More United Than Ever, which is organized by our partners at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs in cooperation with the European Commission's representation in Latvia and the Parliament of the Republic of Latvia. So without further ado, I will move to the first speaker. We are delighted to have with us today Rebecca Harms, former member of the European Parliament, German politician. She has been a member of the Alliance 90, the Greens, part of the European Green Party. And from 2010 to 2016, she also served as president of the Greens European Free Alliance Group in the European Parliament. So without waiting, I would ask you, Rebecca, to outline your views based on your experience, what we are experiencing. Where is the EU's energy and climate policy going, and how feasible do you consider the current policies? The floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for asking me to share my thoughts about where we stand with the EU climate strategy. And for me, it's the case that I very often think about it, because throughout the 15 years I spent in the European Parliament, I shared with some of the colleagues, not with all, but with a growing group of colleagues, one goal. And this goal was, we wanted that sustainable and climate-friendly development becomes the leitmotif of our common European policies. We were convinced that the European Union should try to guide the world by its own example into the green transformation. After I had left the European Parliament in 2019, it was for me personally amazing to follow the promising departure of President Ursula von der Leyen and her college when they really did it. The von der Leyen Commission has not only managed to increase the climate goals, the CO2 reduction targets for 2030, they have also developed a broader strategy called the Green Deal for Europe. I know that a lot of people, and especially also climate activists, are criticizing still a lack of ambitions. I dare to say that although it is obvious that fulfilling the Paris Agreement is not yet guaranteed, the goals fixed now are nevertheless ambitious. And so during the 15 years in Brussels, I myself have often criticized the lack of ambition in climate legislation and the lack of change also in industry and in our societies. But what I see now is that the climate targets are taken much more seriously, and also the sustainability agenda is much more integrated across the different sectors of EU regulations and actions. I consider this mainstreaming of climate targets and sustainability targets as a very important progress. I also often put into discussion that at least my view is that after 15 to 20 years of lack of serious climate action, after decades of blocking and of many shortcomings in the field of climate protection, it is not easy to catch up and to lead Europe and the rest of the world onto a pathway straight to 2 degrees or even to 1.5 degrees. After the Green Deal had been agreed, the Corona crisis became an additional new challenge for Brussels and the member states. The EU Commission tried to focus the economic recovery for Europe also on the Green Deal and tried to establish a stimulus for more sustainable economic development after Corona. While still struggling with the impact of the Corona crisis, the European Union had to react to the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. On February 24th, from one day to the next, the European Union had to react to what since years, and I know it because I was very much involved in this, since years had been predicted by us, so by some of us in Brussels, that this war could happen and that we made some major mistakes before towards Russia. After Putin declared openly war to Ukraine, it was obvious that the EU member states, with Germany in a leading role, had first of all developed a deep dependency on energy imports from Russia. Secondly, had helped Putin to fill his war chest as important client of Gazprom, Rosneft, and Rosatom, and had financed the big war against Ukraine. So that was a moment of truth for the European Union, so learning from this is going on until today. The difficulties which the EU is facing started with the beginning of the war in a very, very severe way. The economic sanctions against Russia is something what deserves much more attention. From my point of view, we have to criticize the quality of the sanctions as much as insufficient delivery of weapons to Ukraine. The sanctions, which meanwhile show clear results on the Russian economy, could do much more harm to the aggressor state if the member states would not have ignored their increasing dependence on Russian energy resources for so long time. For now, it has to be recognized that we were in Europe really late with the transition to renewable energy. So the growing dependency from Russian gas resulted also with a lack of ambitions for the energy transition, at least for Germany and other countries, other old European countries, I can say so. Much more would have been possible if we would have invested earlier and in a more systematic way into a serious renewable strategy. Another mistake in Europe was that for decades, the potential of energy savings and efficiency really have been ignored. It was really astonishing experience that after February of last year, suddenly people started to think about how to reduce consumption. And the negawatt strategies finally became interesting also in our governments and ministries and in the daily life. I'm convinced that many steps are now taken with legislation and with support measures and programs which will lead to better results. What I really do criticize towards Brussels and also towards my own government and towards other member states is that the focus is still too much on replacing the former Russian sources with gas and coal imports from other quite dubious countries. I can accept that we have an immediate need for energy supply, but we should think twice about new dependencies. A big mistake from my point of view is that the EU taxonomy is very much focusing on gas, which is in clear contradiction with the own climate goals. Supporting nuclear cannot be justified as contribution to reliable, safe, and sustainable energy strategy. I'm missing an honest evaluation of what we see in Ukraine. Russia is the first country which makes Ukrainian nuclear plants part of their warfare, including military attacks and occupation of nuclear plants. Not only the attacks, but also the destruction of the energy infrastructure of Ukraine by bombs and drones means an ongoing threat of a nuclear disaster in Ukraine. Numerous times, all the four big nuclear plants of Ukraine, not only Zaporizhzhia, have been without supply and every time close to a major accident. I said it earlier, it is not easy to meet climate targets after many years without real ambitions. For me, at the point where we are, it is of utmost importance that we get serious about the processes of transformation ahead and that we pull out of technologies which can't be sustainable. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this initial intervention, and absolutely great point about replacing Russian gas with gas from other controversial countries. We have seen a year of struggling to try to get, for example, gas from Qatar, and then by the end of the year we had Qatargate in the European Parliament, so highlighting once again the political consequences of some choices in energy policy. But let me move on right away to our second speaker, Luke O'Callaghan-White, who is Program Manager for Climate, Energy and Sustainability at Friends of Europe. Luke was formerly Senior Researcher at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin, where he led the Institute's research on climate and energy policy. So Luke, I would like to ask your assessment about the latest developments in the EU's climate and energy agenda, so the Repower EU plan, for instance, and your own views about the energy diversification strategy of the European Union. The floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thank you, Marco, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be joined with fellow panelists today and all of you in the room. I think it's perhaps best to acknowledge that there have been so many energy files already this year in the EU. Already in 2023, we've seen the introduction of the Hydrogen Bank, the plenary backing of the energy performance of the building directives, and the Commission has introduced its Green Industrial Plan, and that includes a number of quite important acts and reforms to markets. Looking back, though, 1 year on from the invasion, I think we can see the Repower EU plan as a thoroughly important development in the Commission's approach to energy policy. In many ways, it's a surprise that there was so much surprise that Europe needed to come forward with an advanced and proactive net zero industrial plan. Equally, and echoing the points made by Rebecca, it's a surprise that it was a surprise that too much dependency on Russia was only going to end one way, but the addiction to cheap fossil fuels leads to this kind of blight of thinking. But the Repower EU agenda, it's a toolkit for self-reflection. and it's really helped to steer some of the priorities that I mentioned a moment ago. And I think it might be worthwhile just reflecting on the three principles, the three main pillars of the Repower EU agenda, and to try and accelerate the dependency on Russian energy imports and accelerate the clean transition. And that was the first pillar, to accelerate the transition. And yes, the rapid reduction of dependency on fossil imports is to be commended and to be acknowledged. That, you know, at the end of last year, just under 13% of imports from Russia went into the European gas imports. That previous year was 45%. But equally, picking up on Rebecca's other point about criticizing the sanctions, it's important to note, I think, also that we're still importing between 10 to 15 terawatt hours of LNG from Russia, and this is outside the current sanctions package. And there's nothing to say that Russia won't simply end this LNG export to Europe. But I think that the recalibration of energy policy with the precipitous decline in imports from Russia shows what's possible in a short space of time when there's a commonality in facing a crisis. Well, climate change is also, as we've already discussed today, a very severe crisis that we're all facing. And what's to be welcomed in the Repower EU plan is the commitment to upgrading the Renewable Energy Directive to 45% by 2030. And that's not also only important for accelerating the transition, of course, but it's important to also signal to investors that this is the direction of travel and this is the path that Europe is going to take. And equally, in the Repower EU plan, there is explicit acknowledgement that none of the divestment from Russian fossil fuels is possible unless the Fit for 55 agenda is implemented fully. And in fact, the Repower EU plan forecasts that we will need a quicker reduction of gas in the European energy mix than the Fit for 55 agenda projects. So we know that clean electricity is going to play an even more vital role in our energy mix by the end of the decade. And I think 1 year on, we two reflections that I have here on this front. There are two serious barriers that need to be addressed. One is with respect to permitting. It just simply is not feasible to allow up to a decade to go by before offshore or onshore wind projects are permitted. And there needs to be a way in which environmental impact assessments and biodiversity assessments can be conducted thoroughly and not rushed, and also meet the demand that we have for renewable technologies. Equally, we need a far more integrated electricity grid in Europe, and there are my two takeaways in that first agenda. But the second pillar in the Repower EU plan was to save energy, and I think this is one of the clearest successes of the agenda over the last year. Natural gas consumption declined in the period of August to November by 20% compared to typical months, and that's quite something. And I think that we managed to get storage to 90% and to introduce the council regulation to reduce consumption of gas by 15% is also very important. On the question of solidarity mechanism, it's important that I'm coming from a small country, Ireland, we have absolutely no gas storage, but that there is a burden sharing mechanism imbued in the Repower plan such that this is the approach to take to energy security. It's an all for one, a one for all approach. And I think that is to be welcomed. Equally, though, I think as we prepare to the end of the month, the 15% consumption reduction target will end. I think it's important for the Commission to maintain that reduction target into the year ahead. We know that with analysis from Bruegel, if there was to be a complete withdrawal of Russian gas in the European energy market, we would need to see a 20% reduction in this winter to make do. And of course, when we're talking about energy consumption reduction, we're talking about effects on the standard of living, we're talking about real distributional impacts. And in the context of increased interest rates by the European Central Bank this week, a very uncertain economic landscape, it's going to be important to consider these social elements as well. And the very final point, and we discussed this previously, Rebecca commented on the focus on diversifying energy sources being excessively on the question of gas. That's absolutely true, that the replacement of Russian gas with liquefied natural gas, much of that itself fracked, is not doing anything to enhance Europe's environmental or climate credentials. But it's also clear that gas is a transitional fuel, and if we're going to have a glide scope approach to net zero, we'll need to use it in the short term. We've seen astonishing developments here with the Netherlands and Germany acting to increase their capacity. I think the combined capacity now is something to the effect of 40 BCM by the end of the year, which is astonishing. One of the most important elements of the REPowerEU plan really is I mentioned the burden sharing a moment ago, is its focus on joint procurement. And that joint capacity for imports is going to be really important for the EU this year as we enter into another very tight LNG market. Think about how we manage the COVID pandemic. Smaller countries like Ireland would still be waiting for vaccines if we didn't have an EU-wide joint procurement. So on top of making long-term arrangements with very dubious economic partners, I think it's regrettable that countries, major economies like Germany, went ahead for this partnership with Qatar. It has the potential to force member states against one another, which is not in the spirit of solidarity or in the interests of European energy security as a whole. But I just want to conclude by acknowledging the real concern that has already been made, which is the question of lock-in and committing to stranded assets. LNG terminals typically have an economic lifespan of around 40 years. And if we're simply if we're to jump on the LNG bandwagon, so to speak, we might find ourselves in a really precarious situation, not to mention our climate credentials in not so long from now. So the solution to that is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but perhaps to adopt a regional approach to LNG. It's not needed everywhere, but of course, you know, the question of floating storage or gasification units in the Baltic Nordic region, in Poland, in Germany and the Netherlands clearly will help to alleviate some of the energy burdens in Southeast Europe and in Eastern Europe. But it's not the case that every member state will need to invest in LNG, and it's certainly not the case that LNG is in the interests of Europe's climate future. So thank you very much for the invitation. Look forward to the remaining of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Luke. We'll certainly come back to some of the issues that you both raised in your first two contributions. But now let me move on to our third speaker, Veronica Slakay-Tute, from researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. Veronica is working on the project Securitech, funded by the Carlsberg Foundation. And she's investigating new energy infrastructure in the Baltic region. She's the co-author of a report on energy security in the Baltic region, together with Isabella Survillo and Trine Willumsen-Berling, which was published last October. So Veronica, I would like you to zoom a bit into this area, as after all, it's the area that we also share, whether you are based in Riga, in Helsinki, or in Copenhagen, as in your case. Can you tell us the main highlights, or some of the main highlights of the report? How has the war impacted on regional energy security?
Hi, and thank you for the very kind introduction, Marco, and for the invitation to this panel. So without further ado, I would just like to take you on a little trip around the Baltic Sea and to look into highlights of the country's energy mixes, as well as the impact on energy security following the war in Ukraine. We don't have enough time to go into all of the cases, but I'll try to address as many as possible. I'll start with my country of residence, and I think mostly when speaking of Denmark, our thoughts kind of immediately jump to wind energy and futuristic energy islands and all of that sort of thing. Essentially, the country is often used in a synonymous mode with sustainability. And I think something that is less commonly known is the domestic oil and gas industry in the North Sea. For years, this self-sufficiency and self-sustainability did not point to wind, but to fossils instead. So with the war in Ukraine and also the aim to become more carbon neutral, the ambitions to develop these wind projects are further accelerated, but this time far more focus is actually placed on the physical aspects of energy security when it comes to this particular infrastructure. Now, going to Sweden, there are a few sources that really stand out in the energy mix, and that concerns nuclear energy and hydropower. And together, they account for approximately 50% of the energy mix, which basically places Sweden very high up in the race for climate neutrality. An interesting story actually relates to natural gas. It presents only 2% of the national mix, but the West Coast area is kind of dependent on this fossil fuel for household heating. In this area, it represents approximately 20% of the mix, and with only small storage and small-scale LNG units that are not connected to the main grid, Sweden is dependent on a single pipeline connection to Denmark. Now, this has never really been seen as a security issue as such, but then we had explosions in Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. So essentially, the war in Ukraine accelerated a supplementation strategy here, and now more focus is being placed on biogas because it can be produced locally, and it can also be inserted into the natural gas pipelines without changing the infrastructure. I think I'll jump over Finland and focus on Estonia now. And one thing that really stands out in the national mix is shale oil. Estonia has a massive shale oil industry, and it enables Estonia to stay relatively independent, but it also poses a massive challenge to reaching climate targets. Shale oil is generally often reported under coal, although it emits far more CO2 than coal does, approximately 26%. And today, shale oil remains to cover approximately half of the domestic energy consumption, which is quite a lot for a tiny country. Gas does not really represent large share here, but it is a transitional fuel, as it has been addressed before. And while to achieve the 2020 targets for Estonia, it was enough to contain the growth of emissions. Looking ahead, the emissions need to be reduced significantly, which points to cutting production and consumption of shale oil. Now, with the jointly leased FSRU with Finland, the small demand can be covered without Russian gas. However, it has triggered some interesting questions over energy isolationism, as Finland disputed Estonia's claim to priority use. And in late 2022, another joint project was announced with the Latvian authorities regarding offshore wind farm to be commissioned by 2030. And also following the war in Ukraine, more attention is being paid to potential use of small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs for short. Now, if anything, Latvia proves to be a very complicated case. And on the one hand, it joined Estonia and Lithuania in cutting all energy ties with Russia. But on the other hand, it also continued Russian gas imports through intermediaries to get ready for winter. And similar story also appears when looking into the national gas sector unbundling. Gazprom remains to be one of the stakeholders in Latvia's Gase, which is the most significant natural gas trader in the country. And attempts to diversify using LNG kind of lack consistency too. Currently, September 2024 is listed as a tight deadline for LNG facility, but I would say it does not really sound tight nor urgent. That being said, Latvia holds a very important strategic role in the region because it houses the underground storage facility that ensures energy security for the fellow Baltic states through solidarity agreements. And one more thing to add here, notably for Latvia, the Soviet hydropower infrastructure actually carries the country into the green transition rather than producing lock-in effects, as it happens to be the case in many other Soviet, post-Soviet states. There are two countries in the region that kind of get to say we have tried to warn you, and that would be Lithuania and Poland. And starting with Lithuania, the diversification of gas and getting out of Gazprom's grip in every sense of the word has been an important mission for the past few decades. The FSRU independence for liquefied natural gas kind of stands as a testament for energy independence, and projects such as GIPL with Poland that surfaced in 2022 actually encode decades-long preparations and strategic goals. So these efforts together kind of enabled Lithuania to pioneer the decision to break all energy ties with Russia. And here, the national policy changes following the war in Ukraine are aimed at speeding up the renewable energy projects and improving efficiency measures. Both are in line with the green agenda. And one of the biggest projects driving this change would be the offshore wind farm that should satisfy approximately 1/4 of the domestic electricity demand by 2028. And much like in Lithuania, the Polish gas sector follows a similar track and is sufficiently diversified through multiple bidirectional interconnectors, as well as LNG terminal, storage facilities, and many other things. And they enable the country to operate without Russian fossils. On the flip side, however, Poland remains to use huge amounts of coal. Nearly 70% of electricity is still being generated using this fossil. In a way, the war in Ukraine did not really affect the Polish energy sector much besides the price boom, but still a mass action is needed to attain the climate targets. And one of such options has always been nuclear energy, which has been on the Polish agenda since very early 70s, with no reactors currently in place. On the bright side, the turbulent times also accelerated big-scale wind energy projects in the country, but let's see how they turn out. And I think that's all we have time for, at least for the time being, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Veronica. And by the way, you also mentioned the Nord Stream explosions. Often the debate is about who is responsible. We hear a lot less about the environmental damage that the explosions caused. I read some estimates according to which the release was the equivalent of 1% of Germany's annual greenhouse gas emissions. And these are just estimates. But okay, let me move on to the next speaker, Jana Zabanova, who is research associate at the Research Institute for Sustainability, Helmholtz Center, Potsdam. In Potsdam, Jana is working on a project on geopolitics of the energy transformation, implications of an international hydrogen economy. So I would be very interested in your comments on hydrogen. Of course, I've just mentioned this project, but also you have co-authored a paper titled "The Crisis in Ukraine: Another Missed Opportunity for Building a More Sustainable Economic Paradigm." Can you tell us more on this and why is it a missed opportunity?
Sure, Marco. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm happy to be speaking here after all these excellent inputs. Basically, last year we were all so shocked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and my colleagues and I started thinking about, the challenges that posed to Europe's resilience, strategic resilience in terms of supply chains, and to Europe's future strategic partnerships. And we thought that REPowerEU has a lot of, I think it's really groundbreaking. It changed so many things, but that we found a few aspects that could have been maybe pronounced more, especially moving forward and thinking more strategically about the future. And these two things are circularity and also how to build strategic partnerships with the global south. So speaking of the circularity, we've heard, of course, more about it as time goes on, but I think it's really important to internalize that we cannot reach net zero without circularity. I mean, it's just as simple. We cannot reach it without circularity. And circularity has so many benefits. Of course, it reduces the use of primary materials, but also it reduces energy use, and especially in a lot of energy-intensive sectors that are hard to abate. It reduces the reliance on imports, which is a strategic dependency, right? It also creates local jobs. And when we think about it, I was very happy to see that, for example, yesterday, the Strategic Raw Materials Act, there is a recycled content target in consumption 15%. That's a very welcome thing. But we shouldn't think just about strategic raw materials. I mean, circularity is really much, much more encompassing. It goes far beyond just recycling. It's really changing the business models. For example, in the car industry, there's this model of using a car battery as a service. So you can go to a car shop and you use the battery and you pay for the service. and many things. Circularity in the very energy-intensive cement and construction industry. For example, in the construction industry, you pay a lot for the landfill usage, for the emissions. And so if you do more circularity, that could help reduce that. So circularity has a big promise. And I think the regulator, the policymakers in the EU have a lot of potential to create demand for circular materials, to certify the quality of circular materials, to kind of help create the market for them. I think there's much more that can be done. And I think one more important aspect is circular economy is a data economy. Without digital solutions, we cannot go forward. And digital transition is such an important part of the EU Green Deal. I mean, just look at it, smart waste management, smart approaches to energy and resource use. You can reduce so much. It's so good for energy efficiency. You can, for example, we need to have to calculate the life cycle environmental impact of the product, right? That's the EU is working in this direction. How to achieve that? It means companies along the value chain, they have to share information at every step of the way to be able to calculate it. I mean, there's just so much. And I think the EU is really just starting on this path of Industry 4.0. There's so much promise, and I think sometimes it's not addressed enough. So the second challenge is about strategic partnerships. I live in Germany, and I think there's often this kind of wishful thinking, okay, now we don't import from Russia that much, but let's look at the global south, and we can import green hydrogen, green electricity. I mean, it's all good. But if you really talk to the stakeholders in those countries, if you go to Egypt, if you go to Morocco, if you go to South Africa, what do they want? I mean, obviously they want to capture more of the value domestically. They want to shift from this model of supplying resources to the EU to kind of doing more. And so I think there is really a need for the EU and individual member states to think strategically how to structure these partnerships in a way that promote socioeconomic development locally, decarbonization locally, skills development locally. And I think there are many ways to do that are mutually beneficial. And I think also in this geopolitical race globally that we see, it's also a source of important strategic advantage for the EU. It's also a more resilient kind of partnership if you structure it this way. If South Africans can produce direct reduced iron, if Egyptians can produce with green ammonia fertilizers that they could export later. Of course, some political choices are involved in that, what will be the impact on the European industry, but still, I think the idea of this mutual beneficial partnerships with the global south, there's definitely the desire there, and I think there's a reassessment also in Europe happening, but we need to see more of that also in terms of hydrogen, but not only hydrogen. So that would be my input. And I think it connects well to what the other speakers were saying on energy efficiency and kind of rethinking strategic dependencies and diversification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana. A lot of excellent points in a very short time. Just so that everyone is on board, the EU has, the Commission has prepared a Green Deal industrial plan, and yesterday 2 acts were presented, the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act. This is also the context in which the recycling of raw materials that you mentioned is specified. They are quite long documents and they've just come out. So let's just mention them for now before we do a full analysis for one of the next seminars. But excellent point also on what I would briefly call the risk of green colonialism and the EU falling back to patterns of fossil fuel imports that could then be replicated in the green arena with critical raw materials, hydrogen, and so on and so forth. So I would like to remind the audience that you can ask questions if you want via the official Latvian Parliament webpage. So they will then be conveyed to our chat. And we have about 15 minutes left before we close the panel. So your chance is literally now if you'd like to. While we wait for external or audience input, let me come back to some of the issues that were raised already in several presentations. So one key question that's looming, and we know that this is a controversial question in Europe because there are different views, is that of nuclear power. We know that Germany is phasing out its last nuclear power plants in mid-April, so less than a month now. And then at the same time, we hear of plans for new nuclear power plants. For example, Veronika mentioned the Polish project, which has, I think, a planned date for 2033, the first of the nuclear power plants. Usually these dates tend to be rather optimistic. So I would like to ask you, can nuclear make any difference in terms of the green transition, or is it just essentially, I would say, a way to absorb a lot of financial resources, because these are quite extensive projects? So given your past expertise and work on the topic, Rebecca, I would maybe start with you with this question. Your mic is off, so.
To make it a bit more interesting, because I'm known as an anti-nuclear activist since 50 years nearly. I was among those in Germany who immediately, facing the actual crisis of energy supply and electricity supply, partly in EU states, not only in Germany, but EU states, I supported the idea to keep the 3 last reactors running until we know how to deal with the new challenges. I have no problems with a prolongation of these 3 reactors if it's necessary. But on the other hand, I'm quite astonished how much expectations are now again created for a nuclear renaissance. Look to France. So all the new projects they started during the last decades are disasters. Construction time is 15 to 20 years. Costs are overrunning in a way which has never been expected, even not by nuclear skeptics, as I am. I think looking to France right now with EDF close to bankruptcy, the state in the need to take over totally the nuclear industry now, and with a lot of technical problems because of age and because of a lack of surveillance. So looking to France, it should be really done by everybody, every country which wants or plans to start a nuclear program now, like Poland. I think there are very, very good and convincing alternatives, but there is a certain hype around nuclear because it seems to be easy, cheap, fast, and easy, and reliable, and renewable. What I also recommend is to learn from what we see in Ukraine. So I have less fear from a nuclear weapon used in this war than from the risks which are so visible since the very first day of this war, since Russia occupied Chernobyl and Zaporizhia. I think it's quite clear that in a less peaceful world, in a more aggressive world, nuclear is an option which creates more risks than reliability. So we would need another panel to go deeper, also on the SMRs, because, for example, my Ukrainian friends were also interested in the SMRs. They had a lot of debates in Kiev about SMRs. And then they discovered, yes, they exist, but only on Russian vessels or on French drawing boards.
Hi, thank you very much, Rebecca, for this reflection. What comes to my mind also are the cascading effects of climate change. You mentioned France. Last summer, extensive droughts meant less hydropower production, but also less water availability, cool water availability to cool reactors. Unfortunately, this is a development that affects several types of energy production, including nuclear. But would anyone else like to comment on this? Veronica, you mentioned the Polish project. Do you have any insights on this issue?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very important to consider two things. That would be context and scale. So in Poland, the idea is to replace coal. And speaking of coal, of course, it's horrible for the climate, but we also have to understand that the scale is massive, and replacing such quantities does not really happen overnight. And the gradual changes are happening. We are seeing wind and solar farms, but essentially centralized large generation units, they tend to be replaced by other large generation units. And here, nuclear power kind of fits the narrative of sovereignty. And the plans are long-term, as correctly pointed out. They stretch all the way back to 1971, and today we still have no nuclear power there. But yeah, I think I'm not sure if 2033 will be the year that we will see the first reactor. I'm quite skeptical because, yeah, considering the execution and the timeline of the project, who is to say that more delays will not happen? But the plan is to phase out coal by 2049. And according to many Polish experts, it is not possible without nuclear. And of course, environmentalists would disagree. So remains to be seen.
Right. Thanks for bringing this somewhat different perspective, or better, conveying the perspective of people who see a role for nuclear. So before I get back to Luke, I actually would have a question to Jana, expanding on hydrogen. So there is a lot of discussion about hydrogen. The EU has come up with a hydrogen plan already in 2020. We're talking about an energy carrier, not a new energy source, and the EU talks about green hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from renewable energy. How do you see the current European plans? What is the role of hydrogen in the European economy, and what can the EU do in terms of international partnerships in the field of hydrogen, as we know that not enough can be produced in the EU if we look at the targets set by the Commission?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So to me, I think the two main drivers for hydrogen development in the EU were definitely the COVID pandemic, where there was this rise of interest, and then definitely the war in Ukraine, because as we know, REPowerEU, it contains such ambitious targets. There is discussion among analysts whether they're achievable, but in any case, even if it's not 100% there, we are not there by 2030, definitely the ambition is very, very high. However, what I also see, if you look at the percentage of final investment decisions, it's still low. Europe is still leading in the number of projects announced and feasibility studies, but the number of final investment decisions is not there yet. I think this year is going to change a lot because we have the delegated acts with the definition of what counts as green hydrogen. It's almost there, like it has to be approved, but okay. So now the investors have been waiting because they need clarity to invest. And so potential demand is huge. Like you need just so much just to decarbonize, for example, a steel plant. So the potential demand is very high, but the assured demand, the secure demand is still not enough. And that's why there's even fears that we have too many electrolyzer announcements, that we'll have an oversupply in the midst of the decade. So I think there's such a huge role for policymakers just to adopt the definition and I think the EU is really on the way to create demand. No, you introduce sectoral quotas for clean hydrogen use. I mean, that creates demand. You introduce carbon contracts for difference, it de-risks investment. So both on the demand side and on the supply side, there's so much that governments and regulators can do just because it's a new market. And in terms of trade, I think so much is uncertain. I think the way for the EU is first to pull demand in industrial hubs and centers that we see already. The more industries use it, if it's the steel and fertilizer, great. I mean, the more you have, the lower the cost. But also you have to work with the neighborhood, I think. And I think whether we'll see really like shipments from Australia, that's an open question, to be honest. The technology is not there yet, but I think it's definitely feasible if you develop international partnerships for the later stage. But even the IRENA report says that about 75% of hydrogen use will be domestic on site and maybe 25% traded. So I think the focus should be really on industrial uses, on creating regulatory certainty, and then the demand will follow, the investment will follow. And of course, there's now the additional factor of the IRA, of the competition from the US, because we talked to electrolyzer manufacturers yesterday, and they all said, we're interested in Europe, but of course it made us think, we're thinking about the just enough strategy for the years ahead, but we have to also learn more about how the Americans will do it. So it's definitely competition, but it doesn't mean that Europe is behind, but Europe has to speed up its game, I would say.
Right, thank you very much, and also for this reference to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which has been controversial in Europe because of state subsidies that could hoover green investments away from Europe. But let me get back for one final question to Luke. Luke, we have been talking about now long-term plans, nuclear, now also hydrogen. But what about the immediate situation? So if we get back to 2023 and the economics of European energy this year, now, I know you're not a fortune teller, but how do you see the immediate prospects? Have we weathered the storm? Is there the risk for new price hikes?
Well, to be conservative, I think it's too soon to tell. I think that the winter ahead is by no means certain. It will depend on our capacity to maintain reserves. There are a number of questions that will need to be answered. For example, last year, we were willing to pay extraordinarily high prices for gas in the summer to shore up reserves. In the context of the current economic scenario, I'm not sure that that same will is there. Equally, there were many member states, most member states, in fact, in the EU, introduced temporary economic support measures to alleviate the burden on citizens. The ECB have asked for those mechanisms to be withdrawn, but as I mentioned earlier, we're also in a period of very high inflation, and I think people are a little bit surprised at this month's inflation figures. It's slightly stickier than thought. Of course, the wholesale price has come down a bit over the last few months, still well above previous levels. But we also have to see certain weather conditions. We had an extremely mild winter. There's no guarantee that we'll have a winter like that in 23-24. As Rebecca outlined, we had the very unusual, or perhaps should have been expected, but would have been good to be communicated, nuclear outage in France, which had severe effects. Climate change is also having a very direct effect on energy price ultimately. And there's also the geopolitical dimension. We see Russia increasing its pipeline exports to China through the Siberian pipeline. That's giving a little bit more space for LNG. But equally, the Chinese economic growth, I think, is projected at 5% this year. So that might itself push up the price of energy when it comes to winter of this year. So the best I would say is that it's too soon to tell. And we would be very unwise not to integrate some of the emergency mechanisms in the Repower EU plan into how we think about energy going forward. And I think a good place to start is this winter ahead.
Thank you very much, Luke, also for being so quick. Actually, I would like to thank all the panelists. It's now 3 p.m. sharp in Helsinki and Riga, and we were asked to finish on time. So once again, a virtual round of applause to the panelists for their excellent contributions, and I look forward to seeing you all soon and to continue these discussions. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.